Good morning and welcome to our UTD Real Estate Symposium. I am Bob Young. I'm the Executive Managing Director of Weitzman. Weitzman is a Texas-based, privately held, full-service real estate platform specializing in the commercial retail world. And I want to say on behalf of all of us involved, we're so glad you're attending. And not being too presumptuous, but we think that the information that we're going to impart will be of great value to everyone. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to give special thanks to the entire University of Texas at Dallas family for hosting this event. Kudos for all of the leadership from Dr. Randy Guthrey and Julie Lynch and all of their colleagues and students for hosting this event. In addition, I want to thank the Weitzman Institute for Real Estate for its role in this particular event as well. Under Randy and Julie's leadership, a couple of fun facts. The Energized UTD Real Estate Club has doubled in 2 years. Now 700 plus students are taking real estate classes, and there's 4 undergraduate and 4 advanced graduate courses that are being offered. In addition to Weitzman, there are other major companies like the Beck Group, Cornet, Ebby Halliday, and others that have made generous $6 to $7 figure investments and endowments in the program itself, and others as well. Your support of UTD and the growing real estate program is greatly appreciated. Now, today's featured guest, as you've seen from the slide, is truly an industry expert, is a subject matter and much more. Brian Bailey. Brian will provide us with valuable insight and commentary utilizing the mountains of data and research that's gathered and curated by the Federal Reserve System. Our moderators, including me, will be Kay Cotter. Kay is the founder of LKC Resources, professional coach, and she is, as the slide said, is one of the original Staubach Company leaders and before they sold to JLL. And the other moderator is Bill Guthrey, commercial real estate veteran, friend, and the senior vice president with Bill, KDC, and they are the best of class in the land and corporate office build-to-suit business. And so we're happy to have them. All of the moderators will address Brian with questions from their respective expertise areas and see about the changes and challenges and opportunities respectively. As to format, real quickly, we'll have Brian unplugged for 15 minutes. And by the way, I can tell you, based on our symposium prep, that I can assure you his bandwidth on so many economic metrics will leave you not only well-informed, but asking for more. So we want our message to be very clear relative to this event. Pre-pandemic, many of the aspects of the economy and the real estate world were already changing. Corporate workplace issues, human capital and talent, shopping and online business, deployment of capital, construction, so many things were happening. Then the pandemic changed everything. It accelerated the pace of change for all of us in this new area. And so what happened in the CRE world, guess what? It produced a whole new set of variables that were somewhat confusing. They were challenging, and they also had opportunities. These confounding, even befuddling dynamics impacted our economic outlook and next steps. But most importantly, they revealed that the key to how all of this applies is adaptability. Adaptability, flexibility, creativity have now become our standing operating procedure. So Brian, again, on behalf of the UTD community, thank you and welcome, and it's your show.
Bob, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I will do my best, though you've set the bar very high. But thank you for having me today. I'm grateful to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the unprecedented unknowns that we're involved in today, and hopefully you can see the slide deck today. But certainly we have been through, both economically and in the real estate business, we have been through, a very significant, unprecedented time, which has created a series of unknowns. And so with that, I will go to the next slide and talk about, this is just, my opinions today, and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, nor the Board of Governors. Talking about employment, as you can see on the next slide, what we really have had is certainly, we came out of roughly a 10-year expansion. We saw a very significant contraction in employment changes, as you can see on the left. But certainly DFW has mirrored in a lot of ways what we saw in the nation. So you can see DFW's employment compared to the nation in the dotted line there. But certainly DFW has not fared, while the trends have mimicked that of the nation, DFW has fared better in a lot of ways because of the diversity of the economy. Now, talking nationally, What we know is March, we created 916,000 jobs. In February, in March, there were an additional 40,000 revisions upward for February. So certainly some good news there. This morning, we saw initial jobless claims come in at 498,000. While that is still more than double what we saw pre-pandemic, certainly it is a vast improvement over what we saw even 30 days ago, as claims were consistently running over 700,000. So from that standpoint, the nation is, beginning to accelerate. And I think that we're seeing, that similar dynamic right now as far as DFW is concerned. On the right, we can look at the number of jobs per sector locally, and you can see that there are roughly 3.7 million jobs in the DFW area. Certainly the one that stands out, the segment that stands out the most is leisure and hospitality, as it's been hit very hard, both locally and nationally. Looking at kind of the economic evolution on the next slide, you can see part of the reason why DFW has kind of mitigated and not seeing the full dire results that the nation have. And so what this represents is its location quotient, and we've shown the evolution over 30 years worth of data here. And this LQ, this location quotient, is based on employment. So I'm looking at the number of people locally in an industry compared to the total employed locally. And then I'm doing the same dynamic nationally, and I'm comparing those two dynamics to tell whether an industry has a greater concentration in DFW compared to the nation. Nation is pegged at 1.0 in the dotted line there. And so you can see immediately in the first segment, natural resources and construction, where it was below 1.0 30 years ago. Today, it's roughly 1.14, meaning that there are more folks employed in this industry locally compared to the nation. Contrasting that with manufacturing, we saw the reverse occur, where 1990 was 1.05 and today it's 0.89. Certainly, you forward to the far right there, second to the right, leisure and hospitality. And you see the DFW, while not far from the national average, certainly is below. And I think that's part of the reason why DFW is holding up well. Certainly it helps that as a number of us here are in, fire, finance, insurance, and real estate, and that number has grown. But we'll talk about some of those dynamics in a minute. And finally, on the next slide, we talk about kind of job growth in Dallas. And this represents the March numbers, and we can see, as Chair Powell discussed earlier in April, that we were beginning to reach a point of inflection. And we see here for DFW locally that some of the harder hit areas, specifically leisure and hospitality, which is in the second bar from the left, had a fairly sizable job creation number in April. So certainly some good dynamics there. The other thing that I think is making the DFW economy, different, more resilient per se, is migration. And we look at migration, and what we know is, according to the census, roughly domestically on the next slide, according to the census, roughly 125,000 in migration. So domestic migrations came from other states. So they came from California, they came from New York. I imagine even a few came from North Dakota, though I'm not sure why anybody would have started there in the first place. Sorry for that, North Dakotans. But anyways, 125,000 in migration there, according to the census. Texas, and that put Texas at number 2. We look at international migration, about 65,000 from July 2018 to July 2019. Those are the latest numbers. Put Texas number 3. And then United Van Lines which it has a good graphic. Unfortunately, they put Texas at number 19, so just barely made the top third as far as the net number of moves. So people are coming by plane and car, but not quite as many by United Van Lines. But certainly, the numbers are beginning to connect, and certainly I think that migration is a very positive dynamic. It certainly spreads out the tax base and allows the local municipality to spread those costs out over more folks and provide robust levels of service. On the next slide, these represent, this is I think one of the topics we're going to talk about today is retail, and certainly retail has encountered kind of a mixed bag of dynamics. We've seen strip retail that has performed fairly well. We've seen malls, the sellers of goods that have been challenged, and so certainly those dynamics continue to play out. At the same point, because of the pandemic, we had a series of closures, and now the reopenings are kind of reinvigorating the underlying economy, which I think is improving conditions. I think that some of the common denominators, the markets that have lagged some of the recovery, is tech, foreign air travel gateways. I think specifically Dallas and Houston, markets that have high concentrations of hospitality and leisure, and then larger urban markets have been slower to recover. And so kind of contrasting that, looking at the Texas markets in general, you look at San Antonio, which in orange has fared better compared to Houston, which certainly has struggled and continues to struggle, and Dallas in green is kind of in the middle there. If we look at office, we see a similar dynamic in office, but at the same point, more and more markets are lagging, and that is because of the negative sentiment associated with office, particularly around the uncertainty of what does the office of the future look like, as well as what percentage of folks are going to come back to the market. But there are certainly a number of dynamics that have created greater uncertainty in that space, and we've seen a wide variety of folks, of office users that have put a greater percentage of space on the sublease market, which means that those markets will probably have to burn through that to get to kind of a net positive absorption number. We see that question about the shifting cost structure going forward. Will some employers shift some of those costs to employees as they work at home? You think about, if you're working at home, the employer doesn't pay for your electricity, they don't pay for your water or internet, et cetera, like that. And finally, I think one of the questions is just from a personal perspective, how do we view the office of the future, even though it remains in significant flux? And speaking of the office of the future, really, what will it look like, and what percent of people will come back? I thought when I was done with college, we were, done with homework. Unfortunately, that has come back in vogue, and I've been at home in the last year, so homework is, back. But what we see is that in 2019, a very small fraction of workers, so workers pre-pandemic, were working from home based, we've broken it out here according to the number of days. But you can see that by far and away, 75% were in the office. Post-COVID on the right, you can see that that dynamic is facing, based on these surveys and these opinions, a very sizable shift. And I think what we do know, and we'll touch on it earlier, or touch on it later, is that assorting to the task, that may be in the office, it may not be in the office. I mean, you think about highly collaborative tasks, tasks that involve culture, networking, etc., not done as efficiently over the internet and so or over the virtual environment. And so from that standpoint, I expect a lot of those tasks and people who are involved in them to be back in the office, on a more a more permanent basis. But I think if you look at we have invested a huge amount of dollars and resources in making the virtual environment work. And I think that employers will be shy about not utilizing that. And so I think that you'll see, a hybrid model develop. I think that if you're working in the office 5 days a week, it probably looks like 4 days a week going forward or something thereabouts. If you're in I think there's a bifurcation between senior and junior jobs in that, senior jobs are more focused on strategic initiatives, networking, generally tasks that probably need some, the level of interruption mitigated. And so from that standpoint, I think those folks will not be in the office, quite as much as they used to be. At the same point, junior folks, I think that they will still have a thirst for education. They have a thirst for collaboration. They want to learn. Certainly need to be indoctrinated into the respective firm's culture. I think that we have undersold the value of the talk that goes on at the water cooler. For instance, the first topic is how your local sports team did or how the weather is. But then you think about topics, 2 and 3 deep, and really those become what's happening with the client, and that cross-pollination of ideas, I think, is invaluable. And finally, I think, when looking at the future of homework, there will be some industries that do not return to the office. Specifically, I think about IT support during this 12 months. I've personally had some computer problems, and I've been able to call, the Fed's 1-800 number, and someone has been able to remote into my computer, and fix it. Thank God, because I certainly can't. I think of dynamics industries like call centers that have dynamics where it's highly repetitive. But you think about call centers, we can monitor those, can be monitored. Those dynamics can be monitored, whether it's the number of calls on hold, the satisfaction, the content of the call themselves. We have the technology to do that. And so, do those folks need to be back in office or a flex space? I really think that will be rare. And so, kind of in closing real quick, I think that, the economy has improved. Certainly, we've been able to replace about 61% of the 22 million jobs lost. Certainly, I am expecting, a very good number tomorrow as we have the latest jobs report on deck at 8:30. So certainly those are, certainly fingers crossed. North Texas has benefited by a combination of migration and diverse and low-cost structure economy, and certainly those markets will continue to benefit for some period of time. Retail goods sellers, are facing challenges from e-commerce, and certainly some segments of retail, have remained strong, specifically services, convenience, experiences, etc. Takeout certainly has buoyed very well during the pandemic. And then I think, we have a lot of uncertainty around the office space of the future and what percentage of folks will return, and that's created kind of a drag on long-term settlement. But I expect us to reduce that uncertainty over the next year or so. With that, Bob, I will turn it back to you, sir. Thank you, my friend.
Excellent information. I just want to recap a couple things before we move into the formatting part where we have questions. And I mentioned this in a preparation call, but the 61% of 22 million jobs lost is noteworthy. And it's the trend line that's applicable to what's going on. And obviously in our part of the country, and it's a bit parochial to say that, but we're blessed here in North Texas. And you mentioned the migration, and you mentioned the jobs, and a low cost structure. And I think that our state sometimes doesn't take that as seriously as it is. It's an advantage for people in that in-migration of others. You also helped us prep our calls. You talked about the hybrid office. Well, I'm going to tell you there's a hybrid office, there's a hybrid store, there's a hybrid warehouse. It's all hybrid. And we're all learning that, and there's no playbook. And so your comments are of great value. I want to start it off before we go to our other moderators, and I want to talk about the brick and mortar online convergence. And you addressed it, obviously, in reference to the e-commerce effects. You know, some observers are basically saying, oh my goodness, probably no more shopping in a store because I can do it all online. However, the International Council of Shopping Center, a trade organization of pretty big size and importance, has been doing some surveys since COVID began. And one thing that's there is that many customers, many consumers are saying that physical stores in the future will play an important part about not only their own trips and convenience, but also online shopping. And the other issue is that 52% of consumers are saying that well-placed stores help the people see the merchandise, love the brands, and then they buy online. So the words fulfillment now have a different meaning. So my question is, please weigh in on this whole convergence where people think there'll be no stores, but maybe there are. And Brian, as a footnote, I just drove by this morning in Dallas, Beltline Road in Addison, Warby Parker is getting ready to open. You know, that's a native brand that started. They're getting ready to open their third store in Dallas. So help us understand this from your perspective.
Right. Well, you think about, there's a very sizable shift going on, and we can tie it to when the first enclosed mall was built in Minnesota in the 1950s. And so we've had that model for, about 70 years. And so it makes sense that shopping would evolve over time. I think, your question is very right on point. Your points are very right on point. I mean, there still is a significant need on the part of the consumer to touch, feel, be able to physically size up the product. At the same point, we know that there are tremendous cost pressures. And so, buying these products from stores located on high-priced real estate, is a challenge depending on what you're buying. We know that there's some segments that, are premium shoppers willing to pay premiums for luxury goods, et cetera. But a lot of the, areas, because of, modest wage growth, et cetera, been a big focus on discounters. And so that's going to play out as you'll see, somewhat of, showroom dynamics pick up, develop where people can go physically touch these things. At the same point, they can order them online. There's certain industries that I think are safe. I mean, you think about convenience. If I have a child who's sick in the middle of the night, then yes, I am going to be looking for, the closest drugstore, pharmacy at 2 a.m. in the morning, because Amazon, et cetera, is not going to be able to fulfill that order. So I think, convenience will be safe. I think experiential will still be safe. And we, as humans, we're social creatures. I think that, and I know we'll talk about this, but I think that, the office of the future, probably trying to be a success, will borrow some of that experiential dynamic.
Great, thanks, Brian. And that's a great segue to go to Bill, who's in that world that understands the challenges and the opportunities in the office sector. Bill?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me, and Brian, sure appreciate this conversation. And as we got into this, hearing the jazz music at the beginning, it feels like that's what we've been doing for a year. It's kind of like a little soft shoe. It's like not quite sure where this is going and what's next. So it kind of fits with the title of our program too. But along those lines, a month into COVID, we started seeing articles already about the concept of back to work. And of course, we were all leaning into it and thinking, certainly by May, certainly by June. Short story is, end of the year, I did see a great report by B of A that I think had 200 large companies and 2.5 million people asking that question. And the question was, or they anticipated that back to work, that 75% of us in the office would be back engaged, by fall. And, I've kind of given up on trying to figure out exactly where we are, but what are you seeing? What do you know in terms of the office and back to work?
Right. And certainly you've had kind of two schools of thought before people even started to come back to work. I mean, one, you had on one end of the spectrum a significant number of tech companies saying, don't think that folks are going to come back to work. Some of them have moderated that stance. On the other end of the spectrum, we've had some of the traditional businesses, the traditional industry businesses, banking certainly comes to mind as one of the primary bank regulators that, said, yeah, we expect most people to be back, and there'll be, some small component that work from home. I really think it's, highly dependent on the industry, on the collaborative standpoint there. Do see more businesses that are, recalling folks, making their offices more available. So I think that's some good news. I think that, there still is a significant trend right now, early out of the gate, as a number of businesses have said, we're concerned about the footprint, our size of our footprint. And so they are either putting that space up for sublease or saying, longer term, we're going to divest of a significant amount of space. I think what we see is there is opportunities to utilize systems like hoteling, like hot desking, because we've been greatly inefficient with the use of our office space. And so, where people like me are out on the road 3 days a week, I don't need to have a permanent space. I can go in and, to say I'm showing up on Monday and Tuesday, and I need some temporary temporary spaces. So from that standpoint, I think, we'll see some efficiency come out there. At the same point, I think that we're seeing businesses that are telling us that they're indicating that the employees are uncomfortable with these high density seating arrangements, bench seating. Yeah. And so most of the businesses I've talked to have said, we're done with that. Right. And so I think we may actually see this trade-off of more efficiency, but we may also see the need for more space per employee to satisfy some of that sentiment. And then I think, finally, trying to figure out exactly how, what does the office of the future look like? Certainly, I believe it's going to be more collaborative, which probably leads to less fixed wall space and more kind of open areas, teaming areas, things like that.
Yeah, that's great. I was on a call this morning real quickly. For quite a while, we were concerned a little that the tech companies really would embrace this work from home and, what was the future of the office place. But it was interesting that a very prominent company is implementing concepts as they lean into this fall of, really kind of tapping into FOMO, fear of missing out. Point being, yep. We want to get you into the office. It may be 3 days a week, maybe not 5. That's great. But how do we make sure that we get you in here? We do have those connections in the cultural aspect of work. So that was interesting.
Thanks,
Absolutely.
Bill. Thanks, Brian. Let's now go, Kay. We're kind of getting in your space in terms of right. The human element. And Kay, by the way, I was talking, and I learned this from Guthrey, but some time ago, all the meetings with corporate relos and whatever, the HR department was probably never around during those decisions. And now they're not only at the table, they're driving the table.
They're driving it. They're really driving it.
So Kay, welcome, and look forward to your question for Brian.
Well, thank you. It's really good to be here. No, I think our human capital focus, what people are really wanting in the office space, what they're wanting in their life, it's really changing. I saw one graph that showed the idea would be work from anywhere at any time of day. And then you kind of back that up to what's really going to work for the corporation and for the company. And even though we saw interestingly, some productivity increases during the first part of the pandemic, I think that's waning. And the collaborative part, the being together, getting to know each other, part of our business life, our work life, is missing. And I can just say that from what I've read and the people I've talked with, the team building and trust, collaboration, innovation, all those activities are really enhanced in the face-to-face time. So I know that we're going to have, as we've said, hybrids. But when you think about the existing office space that we have right now, and I'd ask Brian this, just the current buildings, as people start coming back and they have, we have this real combination of a day a week, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, all these combinations, what's the impact going to be on the current office buildings that we have? How's that really going to affect our current office space, and what will the landlords do to help the tenants?
Right. It's a good question, and still to be determined, but I think there are some areas that, we've got, a better understanding of what will occur. So I think one, we'll have more collaborative space, and that will give you access, if you're a junior person, to not only your, immediate, cohort or colleagues in crime, let's say, but I think it also gives you the opportunity, to engage the more established and senior level folks, because it's my expectation, what I'm hearing is, a lot of these open floor plans, that the senior folks are expected to be, right in the midst of the junior folks. I do think you make a great point in that, there is, if you're starting your career, there is a very, significant thirst for education, collaboration, networking, etc. And really those are much, those tasks are done much more inefficiently in a virtual environment. And so I do expect more of those folks to want to be back in the office. At the same point, there'll be some trade-offs depending on the drive, depending on the commute, the cost, etc.
Right.
I think one of the areas that office buildings will definitely change is from a safety perspective. We will have to see for improvement, settlement, improvement in in uncertainty. You'll have to have things occur like more air changes per hour. And so from that standpoint, those will probably significantly increase cost from a CapEx perspective. It will also increase operating expense from an electricity standpoint. And additionally, I think we'll see, more innovation around, touchless entry, exit, those kind of dynamics. Finally, I'll laugh about this, in two people to an elevator. Some of my colleagues in Hong Kong, which certainly has been ahead of us in the rebound from the pandemic, stated that it took them 3 hours after they got to the building to get up into their tower offices because they were only allowed 2 people in the elevator at one time. And they said that lasted for about a week. And so from that standpoint, they may see some changes in the common area. There may be less of it because, certainly the cost may increase because you've got more cleaning, but you've got more liability associated, with possible safety, issues from the pandemic.
Well, you said, I think you've hit 2 of the major ones. If you look at the buildings in the future and going forward, safety is huge, you're right, and flexibility. What about the idea, I've talked to some companies that have said, if I could just move walls around more freely, and there are a couple of firms that have done that. I'm going to move accounting closer to sales, and sales is going to be away from somebody else. And so that flexibility, what do you see office building developers looking at in the next several years when they're building new buildings? Because what will be the priorities besides technology and safety in the space that's designed?
Yeah, well, I think one of them is, how do we get folks in and out of the space efficiently and from a safety perspective, which I touched on. I do see more open seating, quite frankly. And so from that standpoint, you may not need the walls to move to move different departments around. So in that respect, I think that open areas will probably be much more in vogue than what we've ever seen before.
great. That's good.
Thanks, Kay, and thanks, Brian. Brian, I'm going to segue into, we're talking about behaviors. Consumer behavior inside the retail space is certainly, the vaccine is in motion. Are people getting more comfortable to come out, get out? Restaurants, shopping, entertainment. And I think they're getting more comfortable. Statistics from ICSE again say that, more than 50% think that the economy and the opportunities are going to improve over the next 12 months. And then a whopping 77% think that all businesses should be open in the future, in reference to that need for interaction and commerce. But post-COVID, we're also hearing consumers say, we want safety. So that's air safety. And that's the contactless world. But the other issue is that they want to be able to find, in the retail space, they want to be able to find products both in the store and online at the same prices. So consumers are really driving this train. Tell us how you see this happening in terms of people getting back into the workforce, into the stores, et cetera.
Right. Well, I think, you look at restaurants and even including small leisure and hospitality businesses. So, at the trough of the pandemic, we saw over 50% of those businesses in those two particularly hard hit segments closed. Certainly in the last couple of months, we've seen that that number rebound, but still, it's a fraction of what's closed. I think that we've improved about 20, reduced that number by about 20% in the last couple of months. But I think certainly there's a question about the establishments that are permanently closed, those establishments that have some kind of financial scarring, as far as the availability for them to reopen, as well as rehiring, which is certainly key for the economy. Yes, consumers are, very interested at being able to physically touch the item, seize it up, and then get the lowest price. But in essence, you're paying, you're discounting convenience in that standpoint. And we've seen, Amazon and the e-commerce crowd, trying to be able to fulfill that component of providing a discount price and doing it as quickly as possible. And they certainly have revolutionized the business in the last decade, where we've gone from several days or a week that it would take for a product to deliver at your home to, in some cases, now just a few hours. And my expectation is that evolution will continue. But certainly, it is a question in my mind, what does consumer behavior look like going forward? We've seen a huge increase, huge growth in the percent of folks utilizing e-commerce. In the most recent numbers, the numbers are, the growth is up like 30%, which is just absolutely unheard of and, quite frankly, unsustainable. At the same point, we saw growth in traditional bricks and mortar stores, collapse. I shouldn't say collapse, but it contracted pretty significantly. And in the last couple of months, it's picked up, basically on your premise that we're seeing more reopenings and people are getting out and feeling an improved sentiment from that standpoint.
I appreciate that. Let's move to Bill. Bill Guthrey, you've got a couple other issues that are pertinent to Brian while we got him here captured.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about the capital side of things. Pre-COVID, the availability of capital domestically and traditional lenders, and really starting to see some foreign investment source of funds. But are you seeing much of a change or anticipating post-COVID? What do you see the capital markets doing, and equity requirements, if you will, and how do we sit, relative to maybe the world?
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for the question. It's certainly an interesting environment right now, as just about everywhere you talk everyone I talk to say that, capital is readily available and really beyond that. I think, it's been interesting in that, we had foreign capital, which you mentioned, kind of waned at the latter part of the decade as, a number of sources pulled back, left primarily our neighbors to the north, as well as a couple of others filling the stack, but at kind of muted levels. And now all of a sudden we're seeing, much more interest from overseas. At the same point, we've had in the lending space, certainly, the banks have been active, the GSEs have been active in their spot, but what we've seen is really the rise of non-bank lenders, whether that's private equity, hedge funds, mortgage REITs, the list goes on, and got active toward the latter part of the last decade. Obviously, most everyone took a time out during the pandemic. And then, question in my mind is, will we see that trend reignite and accelerate? Because certainly, there are vast amounts of capital available. And certainly we see some players that traditionally have not been active that are now getting into, areas of the business that they've not been in before. For instance, seen a number of foreign sovereign funds or foreign investment funds that have all of a sudden allocated huge dollars to the purchase and rental of single-family residential. And so from that standpoint, I think the business is changing. Fortunately, there appears to be, a significant amount of capital. For instance, we know that there have been some woes in some of the high density markets during the pandemic, and life companies stepped away on some of their CMBS traditional spots in the capital stack and CMBS that they were active in. But really, that dynamic went, unfelt, because there were several other capital sources that backfilled that demand very quickly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let's end this section of our format with a question from you to Brian on talent.
Well, I think everything that I'm seeing and the people I have talked with in corporations are saying that the talent that is really going to be a driver in our office space, as we're saying it is in our retail, the population out there, the talent, how we're going to be, running our offices, and what do they want to be able to come back, and what do they really want as their primary driver. So if you look at the talent pool that's out there, the people that are going to be coming back, what can you say generally about your knowledge about the talent pool and how it's going to be impacted in the next year?
Well, certainly we've seen, a very interesting shift. In one respect, businesses, in my view, have become more mobile. And we're seeing, as Texas is benefiting, Florida, a number of low-cost markets are benefiting by, some of these businesses that are moving south, and they appear to be able to find readily available talent in that respect. So I think that businesses, are in some respects, we may see the dynamics change where the talent went to the business, where the business was located. We may see the businesses begin to locate where the talent is, and the talent may, the talent has begun to articulate that some of these high density, high cost markets, they're having trouble fulfilling some of their personal goals. I mean, you look at the cost of having a family and the cost of the shelter in places like New York City or downtown Chicago, and compare and contrast that to, North Texas or Florida or Atlanta, where, it's night and day. And so I think that, we may see somewhat of a reversal of that dynamic and see some businesses that take advantage of some of these low cost states. I mean, I've personally been aware of several dynamics where businesses came out of the Northeast, brought a significant number of employees with them, and in doing so, were able to cut their compensation costs. And you say, wow, they cut their compensation costs and they pulled these people out of the Northeast. That is not going to work for me. But at the same point, some of these businesses move to markets where the cost of living is so cheap that, in essence, even though the talent took a compensation cut, they came out ahead as far as a cost of living was concerned. So I do see that probably becoming having a greater influence.
That's great. That's great.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Kay. We're going to move to another segment, but I just want to thank all of our moderators and Brian. Just a takeaway. We started with the cornerstone of adaptability was what's in front of us, creativity and flexibility. And just now we've heard efficiencies, efficiently. We've heard the fear of missing out. By the way, Guthrie, I love that. FOMO, I got that. That's my new term for the week. Kay, you mentioned work anywhere at any time. By the way, that's the same mantra for purchasers in the retail world. They want to buy whatever they want to buy, when they want to buy it, and where they want to buy it.
That's right.
There's a commonality to that. The whole issue of consumer behavior and comfort. One thing that's happening in our industry, and I'm complimenting the industry, is that we are adapting and creating new opportunities to move forward. And I think that's important. And then the issue of capital. Who would have thought sovereign funds would all of a sudden looking for another opportunities in single family residential? And that, I mean, the world is changing. So what we thought was right yesterday might be right, but it's going to be better and better understood tomorrow. So thanks to our moderators in the group. Randy, I think you're going to take it away here, aren't you?
I am. Thank you, Bob, and welcome everyone. I'm Randy Guthrey, Director of Real Estate Programs and Director of the Weitzman Institute for Real Estate in the Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'd like to thank our keynote speaker, Brian Bailey, and our three moderators, Kay Cotter, Bill Guthrey, and Bob Young. Their time invested and dedication to this symposium is very much appreciated. To the audience, we do have a chat balloon, and if you would like to write a question, in just a moment, we're going to give you an opportunity for your question to be read, perhaps. For those of you in attendance, I welcome you to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions about our real estate programs at UT Dallas. My colleague, Professor Julie Lynch, will now take a couple of your chat questions. Julie?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Lynch, and special thanks to our moderators. They've put in an inordinate amount of time to prepare this great presentation for you today, and I'm certainly optimistic for what the future holds for commercial real estate. We've got a great question relating to inflation. Brian, I'd like to see your thoughts. The question is, there are increasingly more conversations about inflation. What is your take on what role inflation will play in 2021, 22, and 23?
It's a great question, and I'll tell you, I would lie if I said it's the first time I've heard it. It seems to come out more often than not these days. But I appreciate the question, and thank you again for having me. So I think, you know, when we look at inflation, you know, let's kind of bring it home to Texas. So, you know, you think about energy prices, and certainly that has, you know, benefited the Texas economy. But we look back a year ago, and the futures market, you know, had oil priced at one point at negative $37 or some, you know, crazy number. And since then, you know, we've seen it rebound to about $65 or $66 for WTI. You know, we know that has, you know, gone up pretty sizably. That is being picked up in some of the inflation numbers as some of those early pandemic numbers, results from March and April 2020 fall off, and it's bound to see, you know, inflation pick up. At the same point, you think about how many of us are driving the miles that we were on our vehicles pre-pandemic compared to today. And so I think, the cost of energy has gone up, but at the same point, I think that, a number of us from a mileage perspective, are driving less miles, and from that standpoint, probably having less impact on our pocketbooks. Specifically inflation, I mean, we're talking about, our view is that, it's cost push inflation, meaning that as we're seeing industries restart, that they're coming up to full capacity, but it's taking some time for them to get there. And so there are bottlenecks. One you may be aware of certainly, is the 3 to 5 day waiting period for container ships to even get a berth at Long Beach right now. And certainly anything that adds cost potentially creates inflation. And so, from that standpoint, the view is that, we'll see a little bit of an upward run in inflation. We'll see, some heightened results. But certainly our view is, and Chair Powell articulated this when he was speaking in early April, that his view is that those effects are transitory. And so while we'll see, inflation go above kind of the Fed's target of around 2%, our view is that that is transitory and temporary. And one of the things I'd kind of interlink with that is you look at wage growth right now. We saw wage growth that grew very sharply at the beginning of the pandemic, but it has tailed off. And what we know is that there are still, I would say, 8 million, maybe as many as 10 million Americans that are still unemployed. And we know that on top of that, there are roughly 1.5 to 2 million that are underemployed that have reported they have part-time jobs that want a full-time job. And so from my standpoint, there might be some kind of uptick temporarily as people reemerge from the pandemic and spend some of the money that they've saved. But certainly over time, you look at wages, and right now, I'm hard pressed to think that anything but what the FOMC, what Chair Powell has articulated, will occur.
Thank you, Brian. Certainly a dynamic economy for sure. Goes back to Bob's original comment during the introduction of a confounding economy. I appreciate that information. Before I read the next question, the president of our real estate club will be putting in the chat box a comment that we're going to be emailing a link to this recording to all the participants post-production. So you will be getting a link to the recorded production of this presentation. That was one of our questions. Okay, so we actually have a couple of questions on the topic of a 1031 tax exchange, Brian. Yeah. And the question is, what is the potential impact of the removal of the tax benefit of the 1031 tax exchange?
So it's a good question, and certainly it is potential. I mean, we need to highlight that because the conversations as they're fine-tuning and hammering out these bills, nothing is ever set in stone. And so it's been, the notion has been put forward, but certainly we have no idea of where it will fully end up. One of the things I've seen is a study by one of my old professors, Dr. Ling at the University of Florida, with a couple of other colleagues. And a few years ago, they studied the effects if 1031 were to go away. And their thoughts, their conclusions led me to believe that, the value of 1031 exchanges could decline by, somewhere between 10 to 15%. And so, certainly in some respects, the tax environment may change, the tax rates may change, number of dynamics, and so it's really hard for me to fully say. But certainly, 1031 is a significant driver of the net lease business, and if there is a significant change, then you could see a decent size impact in that space.
Thank you, Brian. I hope my former students don't refer to me as their old professor.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be thrilled with when I say it.
I'm sorry, I had to stick that in. Okay, so we've got time for one more question, and it's about the tax revenue implications from retail sales, and how do you see that going forward as the retail market has really shifted to more of an e-commerce situation?
And I'm sorry, give me just a little bit more understanding of that question.
Yeah, so the specific question here was Amazon's impact on the U.S. tax revenue base. Historically, 70% of the U.S. GDP comes from retail. What will that be going forward, do you anticipate?
Well, I mean, I still expect for e-commerce sales to continue to grow. I think that we'll see more penetration by e-commerce as, e-commerce has been able to change consumer buying habits in areas that were, closely resembled commodities, whether it's sporting goods or electronics, books, the list goes on and on. Certainly, they've not been able to penetrate some commodity areas like perishable food, but there certainly is a sizable amount of energy and resources being expended trying to change that. And my expectation is that since the U.S. Lags the world in the amount of e-commerce spending on groceries, that we will change some of that. As far as tax, the specific implications of tax revenue, certainly that's driven depending upon the various legislations of the state, and they may view it differently. But I think that certainly there'll be a greater percentage of tax revenues driven by a greater percentage of the overall pie percentage of sales that's transitioning from e-commerce to that's been transitioning to e-commerce from traditional bricks and mortar retailers.
Thank you, Brian. And I'd really like to give a big thank you to all of our speakers today, our keynote speaker, Brian Bailey, and our moderators, Kay Cotter, Bill Guthrie, Bob Young, and a special thanks to our behind the scenes team who worked so hard to make this production a success. And a special thanks to the real estate department's administrative assistant who's celebrating her birthday today, Kelly Holden. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you everybody for your participation today. Please let us know if there's any way we can be of help to you at UTD. We'll be putting Dr. Guthrey's email address in the chat box for anybody who has any follow-up questions. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Adios.
Great.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.